Good evening. We should get started. I'd like to thank you all for coming out to the Maxine Wetering Women Making History lecture. As I suspect many of you know, this event is part of a number of events that have been organized in celebration of Women's History Month. Tonight's event continues the celebration and honors the founder of Women's Studies and Women's History at the University of Montana. Professor Maxine Wetering was an absolute force on this campus for over 25 years. She came to UM in the late 1960s with an undergraduate degree in physics and history and a doctorate from the University of Washington in the history and philosophy of science. She taught in several departments and across disciplinary boundaries, and quickly gained a reputation as a passionate classroom teacher and an inspirational mentor. She had particular commitments to giving the study of women a place on our campus, and in the early 1970s, she pushed this university to create a women's studies program. She went on to serve as the program's first director and developed the program's core course, which she called Philosophical Perspectives on Women in Western Culture. And I think, as the course's title suggests, Maxine's approach was broad, incorporating approaches of history, philosophy, and political science, as well as physics and geography. I've never had the pleasure of meeting Maxine, but my colleagues insist that she was the type of person who knew absolutely no boundaries, that she approached her work with unbridled joy, and that she transformed the lives of countless UM students along the way. Some of you might know that Maxine mentored 7 UM students who became Rhodes Scholars, which is an amazing feat and really put the University of Montana on the map as a place to come if you want to become a Rhodes Scholar. So please come. So we're here tonight to celebrate her pioneering work and her commitment not only to women's studies, but to undergraduate liberal education more generally. So again, thank you guys for coming and joining in this celebration. I'd like to thank several of my colleagues who supported me with their time and wrote letters to help get funding and all of those fun things. Robert Green, the chair of the history department right there. Anya Jabor, professor of history and co-director of the Women and Gender Study program, and Tobin Miller-Shearer, professor of history and director of the African American Studies program. If you guys would join me in thanking them, I'd appreciate it. Finally, the bulk of the financial support for this event came from the Provost's office. And I, of course, would like to thank the Provost's office for supporting Women's History Month. I also want to note that we in the history department and Women's and Gender Studies would like to see this event held every March in perpetuity. And to make that happen, we've instituted a giving campaign called the Maxine Wetering Women Making History Women's History Month Fund. It's a bit of a mouthful, but we'd like your support. If you'd like to help us continue this event to kind of honor the spirit of intellectual inquiry that Maxine Wetering embodies, please speak with me or Anya Jabor after the talk, and we'd be glad to chat with you about that. Without further ado, I'd like to invite my colleague Dan Flores, a professor of history, the Hammond Professor of History, Western History. Wow, a lot of things to go along with that. Here at UM to introduce our speaker tonight.
I want to join Kyle in thanking everyone for coming out tonight. I think you'll be delighted at what you're about to hear. It's my honor to introduce Cathleen, who I met several years ago. And so, as a way of kind of letting you know a little bit about her, let me offer you this introduction. About a quarter of a century ago, when I was a young assistant professor at another university, a lot farther south, a lot warmer, and a lot flatter terrain than this, a graduate student there at the time exposed me to a term in Indian history I'd never heard before. the field matron. It referred to women employees of the Indian Service who worked with native peoples who were undergoing acculturation and reservation life in the 1870s and 1880s. I remember thinking then what a terrific research project a book on such women would make. Rebecca, that was the graduate student's name, didn't write it. She wrote an MA thesis instead. But that was one of the reasons I found Kathleen's 211 book, Federal Fathers and Mothers, A Social History of the United States Indian Service from 1869 to 1933, so exciting when it came out. A book about women, about married couples, and Native employees, too. Working for the Bureau of Indian Affairs was one of those great ideas out there that was just waiting for somebody to do. And both its publisher, the University of North Carolina Press, and people like me were delighted when this book appeared to terrific reviews in the journals and prizes like the Labriola Center's American Indian National Book Award 2 years ago. At her posting at the University of New Mexico, Dr. Cahill is now on to more terrific projects on Native peoples and gender and ethnicity in the West. I want to tell you briefly about a couple of them. She has 2 book projects going that for sure excite me. One of them on women of color in the movement to grant women the vote in America. And the other on West Coast Indians' relationships with highways, especially the 101 that runs the length of California just inland from the coast and has been kind of a cultural and historical marker in California for a long time now. I can tell you, as somebody who is wildly interested both in Indians and in the automobile and Americana, this is the kind of book that I simply can't wait for. I met Cathleen at a conference or two across the last decade. Talked to her usually fairly briefly at those. But 3 or 4 years ago, an old friend, the University of New Mexico Western and Women's historian Virginia Scharf, who is one of Kathleen's colleagues, held a dinner at her Albuquerque home for a group of friends, and I happened to be in Santa Fe at the time, so I got to spend an evening over dinner with Cathleen away from conferences and universities. So I'm here to tell you that this is a woman, despite her academic credentials and ambitions, who is a great dinner companion for all kinds of non-academic reasons. And I'll offer you just one example from that evening. At a dinner that included all manner of writers, photographers, and intellectuals who were both in universities and outside them, I think at some point during the night, one of us counted up about 36 books that had come out of this group around the dinner table. Someone, okay, I'll confess it was me, posed a simple definition question that had everybody at the table stumped. What in the world, I asked, in some lull in the conversation, does the acronym spelled MILF mean? I keep encountering it, I said, and I confess I don't have a clue. Does anybody here know what MILF means? Everyone at the table, all those brainiacs with half the knowledge in the world stored in their memories, was stumped. Except, you guessed it, Cathleen. Well, she said, a little shyly, but obviously sure of her take on it, a MILF is, if you don't know what a MILF is, you can Google it. Or, of course, you can ask Cathleen, because she knows stuff like that, too. So, I'm sure we're not going to hear about MILFs tonight, but I expect what we're going to hear is going to be fascinating. So, Cathleen Cahill, thank you.
All right, I have to turn on my multiple little wires here. How's that? Can you hear me? Back there? Okay, thank you. Well, after that introduction, I don't know, I can follow that very well. But thank you so very much. It is an immense honor to be here, and I want to thank Dr. Volk for inviting me and all of the people who collaborated to bring me here. It's really an honor. And thank you, Dr. Flores, for that introduction. And it is true, and when I first met him, I was a lowly graduate student, and he was a giant in the field. And so to have progressed to now the person that explains popular culture is, there you go. But I do, my justification is I need to know what my students are thinking, so I need to be up on these things. It is also an incredible honor to be here for Women's History Month and to be representing this lecture for someone who sounds like such an amazing woman who's done so much for the study of women's history. And of course, Montana being a state that has also a very long history in terms of women's suffrage. And I will say that I am in awe of sort of the websites and things that the Historical Society has put out this year for the anniversary of women's suffrage. It's really, we've been following it in my department. So what I wanted to do tonight for this lecture, this talk, is focus really on the women and their experiences. In the book, as was mentioned, I do cover a broader range. I look at married couples, I look at men, both native and non-native. But tonight I'm going to really focus on the women. And what I thought I'd do is tell you a little bit about how I came to the project. And it's funny that you mentioned field matrons, because that was my entry point as well. When I graduated from college, I went to UC Davis, and I grew up in Northern California, further north, Humboldt County, which you may have heard of. And I graduated from college, and my aunt and uncle knew that I was a history major, and they gave me a book of local history from Humboldt County. And what it was the memoir of two women from New York who had served as field matrons on the Klamath River near the Hoopa Valley Indian Reservation. And I read this book and was really surprised by what was in it. I had no idea that in 1908 the federal government was hiring women, first of all, and that it was then sending these white women from New York City out into what for them was the wilds of Northern California, right? Mountainous terrain. And it just really went against everything that I thought about women's history. Now, I had been a history major, so I perhaps should have known better, but the idea that this is before women have the vote federally, and here they are employed and again sort of sent out on this, what for them was a great adventure. So for my master's thesis, I wrote on the field matron program. But as I did that research, I realized there were so many more stories and so many more sort of unexpected things about the Indian Service. And to give you a brief definition, the Indian Service is the sort of the employees or the workforce of what becomes the Bureau of Indian Affairs. At the time, it was called the Office of Indian Affairs. But so I discovered all of these unexpected things. And if you take a look at this picture, I think this is, I love this picture. It's in the book, and it's an embodiment of sort of all of those unexpected things that I found. This is the teachers and staff of the Albuquerque Indian School, probably late 1890s, early turn of the century. And as you look at it, you can see that it is made up of women and men, right? But also native and non-native, and possibly even some Hispanic folks. And then also over here and up here, there are two little children, which I'll mention later. So let me just give you, this is the visual of the unexpected, but let me tell you, let me start with some statistics, and then I'll move away from math. But in 1869, the Office of Indian Affairs employed just over 600 employees total, right, on all the reservations in the United States. There were a few schools. 28 of those employees, less than 5%, were women. Okay? And all of those 28 were non-native. They were white women. By the end of the century, so just over 30 years later, there were over 4,000 employees in the Indian Service. And the Indian Service was then made up of two units, the school service and the agency service. And together, 42% of all the employees were women. Okay? If you just break out the school service, over 62% of them were women. And this is a trend that continues, this is 1890 through into the first decades of the 20th century. So within that 30 years, something major happens, right? There's a big shift. And by the century's end, this is a very different bureaucracy than it had been right at the end of the Civil War, right? Something else was happening as well. There's another big change. Between 1834 and 1864, so the sort of 3 decades before the Civil War, in total, the Indian Service had employed 250 Native people over those 30 years, right? So Indians with positions. After that period, in those same 3 decades after the Civil War, those numbers also skyrocketed. So here's just, again, this is just the school service, and this is in 1885, and you can see that Native women already make up about 1/4 of the school service. Very small number of African Americans. So the numbers of Native employees are also skyrocketing, and by the end of the century, about 25% of the Indian Service are Native people, and many of those are women. So again, between 1870 and the turn of the century, something massive changes, right? And so the question is, what was it? And so again, just to return to this, at the turn of the century, the Indian Service, a federal agency, is really unique and really unusual. It's made up of women, Native people, and married couples, which I'll mention today but not go into in great detail. This is at a time when, again, most women, particularly middle-class women, do not work, right? And they certainly don't work if they're married, where jobs for Native people tend to be manual labor if they're wage paid, and certainly not at all white-collar labor. And some of these people, as I'll discuss, will be white-collar. And so, you know, how do we get to this point? What happened, right? And this is very different from almost any other federal agency or really anything in the public sphere as well. And it's also a moment, these 3 decades, where we see the shift from patronage politics, where you owe your job to a politician who will give you a position if you promise to vote for him, right? Well, women and Native people can't vote in most cases, right? So we move from that to civil service reform. So that's going to come into it. So again, the question that I want to ask is, why do things change, right? Why does the federal government begin to hire so many people that are not being hired in other places? But more interestingly, I think, why were they taking those jobs, right? Particularly the Native people. Why were they choosing to work for an organization that, as we'll see, was really not looking out for their interests? And what were their experiences? So I'm going to do this today in 3 parts. I'll briefly talk about what the federal government thought it was doing, the sort of theory behind Indian policy at this time. Then I'll talk quite a bit about the experience of the employees. And then I'll close by thinking about some of the unexpected consequences of bringing all of these people into federal employment and what happened and how they, in fact, changed the government. Right? So, whoop, we're not, no? All right. I'll get there. After the Civil War, as Americans began to really turn to the West and think about settlement, they encountered what they described as the Indian problem, right? The Indian problem. And this had a sort of a couple of strands that came together in terms of what they were referring to. One of which was this idea that anthropologically, Native people and traditional Native cultures were incompatible with modern civilization, right? And that the result of a sort of clash between modern civilization and Native culture was that Native people were disappearing. Right? They couldn't handle it. This was the sort of theory of the vanishing Indian. So there's sort of the theory. And if the only way some people argued for Native people to be saved from this vanishing was for them to give up their cultures and assimilate to sort of modern society, modern gender roles, modern family forms. So there are these thoughts. But then there are also sort of other kind of more practical thoughts, which was people saw that the federal government was paying out on its treaty obligations, right? There were a certain number of obligations that the federal government had agreed to, particularly to protect native land bases on reservations, and often to supply rations or sometimes employees for education or health, things like this. And this was costing the government quite a bit of money, right? And people didn't like that. They also saw a lot of land on reservations that they argued was not being used appropriately, right? It wasn't being used for farming. So underneath this sort of concern for Native people, right, were these economic reasons, right, that there were resources at stake. And so the plan was, how would you sort of end federal obligation and open up this land to white settlers? And they said, well, we can take Native communities and Native cultures and recreate them again along the lines of this particular model, this particular family model. And it was the Native cultures, and I have just 4 here, right, were extremely diverse. But the government sort of came up with this, if they all could just be made to fit one form. And they, of course, design a series of programs to do this, right? And these programs are based absolutely on a family model. So the field matrons are one program that was aimed at adult Native women on the reservation. We used to call them, when I was in grad school, the Martha Stewarts of the 19th century. Their job was to go in to homes like this and tell Native women, well, here's how you bake bread, right? Or here's how you should be, what kind of clothes you should be wearing. Or here's how to make your home neat and clean. You should hang up these pictures from like Harper's Weekly on the wall or something like that. But the most famous programs, of course, are land allotment and the boarding schools, right? And both of these were meant to take the diversity of Native cultures and turn them into, or reform them into families that had a male head of household, a patriarch, right, a father, who would be at the head of the household and who would be economically responsible for his dependents. So this argument was, we can move Indians off government dependence onto the dependence of these heads of households, right? So their job is to sort of farm and make money and keep care of their dependents. Their dependents are their wives and children, right? But women play a really key role in this model, in this assimilation model, which is that in Anglo society, women are the ones who raise children, right? Who do the work of socially reproducing the next generation, right? So you have to get mothers involved in order for this to perpetuate itself, right? So fathers are going to be in charge of sort of economically providing for their families, but mothers play the key role of raising the next generation of children. So allotment, federal policy of land allotment, took communally held native land and divided it up into private individual lots, right? And each head of household got a lot. And then the boarding schools were designed to teach Native people how to use those allotments, right? But there's one more thing I want to mention, which is, again, the sort of role of mothers being key. Native mothers were seen as unable to teach Native children how to live on these new allotments, right? Native women in particular are castigated as mothers who are not fit for sort of helping the next generation survive, right? They're going to vanish if Native mothers continue to teach them to live this way. And so the argument becomes, we have to remove children from particularly their mothers and put them in these boarding schools, right? And then the next generation will have learned how to be appropriately civilized, as they would have said, and then from there they will teach their children, and the Indian problem will be solved, right? It will take one generation of, again, sort of child removal from parents and put them in these schools. And reformers and policymakers understood that this was, a really going to be a painful situation, right? But they thought it was important, again, for a variety of reasons. But so, for example, one of them said, this is a kindly, cruel kindly cruel surgery which hurts that it may save. Right? Or the more famous is Richard Henry Pratt's "We must kill the Indian to save the man." Right? So they understood that this was in many ways going to be a very difficult thing, but they thought that it was for the best. So in that model, oh, I'm sorry, I should have showed you. So this is, they're obsessed with homes and with families. And this is a 1920 sheet that they went through, and for each allotment sort of wrote down what kind of progress Native families were making towards this vision of an assimilated family. And so they have the names of the family members, what they do. They often talk about what kind of furniture they have in their homes. So these individual details are really key. I have notes that say switch slides. These are some of the boarding schools to which they removed the Native children. Within that model, right, as I said, they're going to move the children out from their own families and put them into these schools. Well, you need some sort of surrogate parent, right? You need someone who's going to teach this generation of children how to behave appropriately. And so the employees across the Indian Service, but particularly in the schools, become really key. And reformers constantly use the language of family and family roles to describe employee positions. And in particular, in the boarding schools, the staff is definitely set up this way. So the superintendent of the school is the father figure. He's the patriarch. He's in charge of everything. He makes sure everything runs smoothly. He does the hiring and the evaluating. His sort of partner in this is the matron. There are often a number of matrons, but there's usually a main matron who's in charge of the dormitories, right? And she takes care of the children. And the language that policymakers use over and over again in the sources is that this person should be motherly, right? And that's one of the job qualifications, is that she should be motherly. And then the rest of the staff also take roles that are part of the household roles, right? So you have laundresses and bakers, cooks. You have industrial farmers who are men who are sort of in charge of the boys, and the whole school institution can be thought of as kind of an extended family. And you can see in this image of the boys' class learning how to garden, right? The father, the sort of, here's the farmer teaching them, and then most likely his wife, and you'll notice that she has her child with her too. So there's this image of the employees as federal fathers and mothers, right? As taking on these positions and teaching the children as they would their own families, right? Now, a lot of historians have looked at some of these things, that there are literally husbands and wives being employed in these positions. So a lot of people looked at this language and may have noticed it, but what I found is that literally the government is shaping the service by hiring married couples in these positions. So that, for example, in 1893, out of the 91 boarding schools, and there are on-reservation schools and off-reservation schools, out of the 91 that report, 48 of them, right, over half, have a superintendent who's married to one of the employees in the schools. Right, so literally, these married couples in those positions. And again, a lot of people said, well, that's just nepotism. The Indian Service is corrupt, and here's another example of it. And that's true. Right? The Indian Service was often corrupt, but I think together with the language that emphasizes over and over again that these employees will be like parents, will be teaching the children as if they were their own. They talk about the children learning the skills that they would learn, and the quote is, as they would learn at in white households at a Christian fire. So there's all of this rhetoric, and then literally married couples. Also, you see the civil service rules change once civil service comes in the 1890s to make it much easier for a superintendent's wife to get a position in that school. So there's even structural changes to sort of encourage this kind of setup. Now, these employees that I've been talking about, these sort of surrogate parents, these federal fathers and mothers, have primarily been white. And initially, most of the employees were white. And again, the plan was, right, the need to remove Native children from their parents. But, so if that whole system is set up like that, you may wonder, where are all these Native employees coming from? Why is the government employing them, right? And you can see here in this image, this is from the Hoopa Valley Reservation in Northern California. Again, a boys' class, and here's the teacher, and she's white. But here's the industrial teacher, who's sort of her male counterpart, and he's Native, right? He's from Hoopa. So why were they hiring Native people to work in the schools? And that logic follows a different set of concerns or a different set of ideas. First, even though the government had sort of given up on adult Indians as sort of a doomed generation, they thought, well, this will be some sort of education, right? A little bit. And initially they hire Native employees in assistant roles. So they were sort of job shadowing, right? They were job shadowing these white employees to learn those roles. So assistant matron, or assistant farmer, or assistant laundress, right? So they were supposed to be educational. And the government actually sort of encourages Native people to take these positions. They think that working will, again, be kind of it will help them along the path to civilization. And they, in fact, offer Native employees non-competitive civil service exams, which means all you have to do is pass the exam and you get the job. You're not competing with everyone else. White employees have to take competitive exams, so you have to get a really high score to get a job. And particularly, as the schools begin to turn out children who are educated, they're eligible through these non-competitive exams for some high-ranking positions if they can pass them. So position of teacher, of clerk, of matron. Later you see nurses. Very, very few number of doctors. But they can take these exams and get these white-collar federal positions, right? So it opens up a little bit for them. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So it's primarily educational. But as some students begin to graduate, they also see it as sort of a stopgap measure to keep them, as they would say, from going back to the blanket, right, from backsliding, that they need a job to sort of encourage them to keep behaving the way that government wants them to behave. But the bottom line, literally, is that Native labor is cheaper. And you see in the records, and if you look at the payrolls, that Native employees were often hired at the Indian wage, which was less than the non-Native wage. So they're much less expensive to hire, and the government needs to hire a lot of people in order to implement this vision, right? This is taking, an effort to change all Native children in one generation. That's a lot, right? So it needs to build these institutions, and Congress is notoriously stingy with its appropriations for the Indian service, so they turn to cheaper labor. Now, before I move on to sort of what the experiences of these employees were, I just want to mention that there's a lot of resistance from the Native children, the students in the schools, to this whole idea that their parents could be replaced, that their families could be replaced, right? And they reject this sort of literally by running away from the schools, by setting fire to the schools, right? Really rejecting the whole idea. And they're in many cases, they've been forced into those schools. Their parents are under duress. They've been told, you won't get any rations if you don't send your children to school. We might put you in jail if you don't send your children to school. And often those children were in school for a very long time and couldn't see their parents. So they reject this, again, sort of physically through their behavior, but they also reject it in interviews. Later with former students, they say this. And they specifically reply to the government's sort of vision of surrogate parents, right? So for example, a Choctaw student at Shaloko Indian School said, quote, "They tried to take the place of your home life, but they can't." And another Cherokee student there said, quote, "The only time you ever saw your matron or talked with your matron was in a disciplinary area. So you see, you didn't love your matron," right? So they saw exactly what was being attempted, and they reject that. But let's talk about the employees for a minute. Why would people want these jobs? And especially, again, the Native employees. Why were they taking them? Again, they know that the federal government is working to destroy their communities or change them drastically and ideally sort of break them up and make them disappear as they exist. So why would they participate in that? Well, the sort of basic reason is it was a job. right? This is a moment on reservations when traditional subsistence economies have primarily stopped working, partly because people have been confined to much smaller land bases. And there are very, very few wage-paying options on reservations or even near reservations. So working for the Federal Indian Service is one of the very few ways you can get cash in what are fairly poor communities. And while a lot of those communities you could still get along with some combination of subsistence or barter, you do need some cash. So for example, anthropologist Alfonso Ortiz, looking at San Juan Pueblo, or now known as Okeowinge, talks about how you needed a little bit of cash for certain things. And he pointed out particularly buying cheese and soap, right? And he said there was usually one member of a family who would get a job. And there were a number of jobs, but one of which he pointed out was an Indian Service position. And they would bring the cash home for their families. So for both Native people and for white employees, when they write in to ask for positions or they're filling out their applications, they talk about, I would like a job, right? And again, in the 1880s and 1890s, these are fairly well paying. They're actually pretty good jobs. Wages stagnate after that. But initially, they're good jobs, and that's what people say. White women also talk about adventure, right? And the two women that their memoir that I read initially, this is on the Hupa Valley Reservation, and you can see they're on this tiny little path, and way down below is the river, right? So a lot of them talk about this idea of going into the Wild West, right, and having an adventure. Others equate it with missionary service. Again, this is something that the federal government had not really been involved with education before. Very briefly with the Freedmen's Bureau during Reconstruction, but other than that, education was something that was left to the states. So sort of a federal position that dealt with education or with Indians, the only thing that was analogous that people could really wrap their heads around was missionary work. And they talk about this again in their applications. I want to do good. I want to go help the Indians. And so they see this as very similar to, again, the home mission service. And some women put that together. So for example, well, not a lot, but multiple times I saw people who would say, I really wanted to go and join the missionary service and go to China. Right, this is very popular apparently in the 1890s, going to China. But my parents wouldn't let me. However, they said I could join the Indian Service, right? Because it was remaining in the United States. So you see applicants kind of combining some of these things where they say, I want a job and adventure, or I want a good paying job and I want to go to somewhere warm. That's another big request. And again, equating it with missionary service is pretty, you see that over and over again. And so they see it as very benevolent, right, and not political, right? Again, missionaries were seen as not necessarily political, and again, partly women and policymakers saw white women as apolitical and thus outside that patronage system that was corrupt, and so this was another reason to hire them. But for Native women, it is, of course, very political. And they recognize it as very political. As I mentioned, it's one of the very few wage-paying positions on reservations. And Native people, but I'm focusing on Native women today, argued that they wanted these jobs so they could stay in their communities. Okay? Now again, that's exactly the opposite of the reason the federal government, what it had set up these programs for, right? It wants to sort of take Native families and Native communities apart and reconstruct them. But Native women often on their applications talk about staying in their communities. So for example, Maud Pecor up here wrote, quote, I have held the position here at Tomah School in Wisconsin as an assistant seamstress for several years. When I came here, my home was in Tomah, but now my relatives are in Oklahoma, and I would like a position in the Indian school near their home. A lot of women would write, you know, I'm in Wisconsin, I would like a job either in Wisconsin or right over the line in Minnesota, right? So kind of a regional, it'd be easy to get home is the implication. So really emphasizing wanting to stay in or near their communities, and that the jobs clearly gave them the opportunity to do this. Other women emphasize not just staying near sort of communities or kin, but very specifically keeping their families together. So for example, Lottie Smith Patey of the Eastern Band Cherokee, who was a woman who had gone to boarding schools herself and had a fairly good experience from her letters, what we can tell from her letters. But she wrote, she was writing to request a transfer to a new school, and she had been told that she would have an easier time of a transfer if she would send her children who were with her off to another boarding school, right, and sort of divest herself of her children, and she would be able to get this transfer. And she writes, quote, "Oh, I cannot think of giving up my little girls. I want to keep Cora in the same school with me, and if possible, to room with me. I think that I could watch over them better than any stranger." Right? So just a very clear rejection of this idea that her children need to be put into a boarding school with these surrogate teachers serving in her place, right? That she can raise them better than a stranger. And she also talks about not wanting them to grow up as strangers from each other. So very much trying to keep her family together. And this is a woman, all of these images come from their personnel files. So these are all images that the women themselves submitted under civil service rules. And this is a woman named Katie Brewer who works in Oregon in the Chamois School. And since she put this in, I suspect that this is one of her children. She had 7 children over the course of her career, and I can't imagine sort of why else she would have a photo of herself with this person. So, I mean, there might be reasons, but I suspect that it's her daughter. And so, you know, these women really insist on keeping their families together, which is a really quite a powerful sort of response to this federal policy. And you see this over and over again in their personnel files. They also insist on their right to have these jobs. In some sense, hearkening back to sort of treaty obligations. But if there are going to be federal positions that have to do with Indians, they insist that they should have them. And they fight for this, and they use their knowledge of the federal bureaucracy and federal rules to make their cases. So in 1913, Selina Kane, a Potawatomi woman, wrote a letter to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, and she's furious in this letter. And she wrote, I went to the superintendent's office and talked to him about it, and I told him that I thought an Indian ought to have been given the position in preference to the whites, and he answered yes. And yet he employed the white instead of the Indian. I said he ought to have protected me instead of turning me down. I said he was going contrary to the government rules, and he knew it, and he had mistreated me enough for me to report this to you, so to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, right? And this was, again, the case that a lot of people made this case, that there are rules and there are positions, and Native people should have those positions. In another case, community members would often support this idea. So at the White Earth Reservation, one of the matrons, one of the teachers was going to be transferred and lose her position. And the community members come up with a petition that they send to the commissioner, and they say, Miss McDougall is a member of this reservation and therefore has both treaty and moral rights to be employed in the Indian service among the Chippewa. Right? So really making claims to these positions. If anyone's going to have them, it should be us. So again, for white women, they often think of they don't think of these positions as political, with one exception for many of them, and that is, once they take the positions, they often begin to think about or come to the realization of what we might call a feminist consciousness, right? Almost all of their superiors are men. I, in my research, came across one woman who was a superintendent of a school. No women were in charge of agencies. So their superiors, and certainly their superiors in the Indian office, are men. And they run up against this. So, for example, women, both native and non-native, are often called girls, no matter how old they are, right? They're referred to as girls. They also run into this glass ceiling where they're not promoted past a certain point. So they're never going to be in these supervisory positions. Another thing that really irritates them is that they are often asked to do sort of extra domestic work, especially in the schools. So say the cook gets sick. Right? They'll turn to the teacher, whose job description is to be a teacher, and say, well, you're a woman. You must know how to cook. Why don't you do the cooking for today? Right? Unpaid. Right? It'll be a separate, you're just going to do it because you know how. And it turns out, actually, many women don't know how to cook. This is also a refrain that they They really don't. So they began to come to this sort of feminist consciousness. And actually in Washington, D.C., and this is sort of where one of those second projects comes from, I do see women in the Indian office get very heavily involved with the feminist movement there, both Native and non-Native women. There's one other, they do, as they join the service, often feel empowered. Sometimes just by being someone who has a job, right, an independent source of income. And this woman was exceptional, but one woman really comes to see herself as a federal employee as an empowering position. So this is a Native woman. This is Lucy Jobin, and this is her oath of office. Now, I think Lucy Jobin, when she had to swear and sign this oath of office, probably had a very different experience than Estelle Aubrey Brown, who is a non-Native woman. But Estelle Aubrey Brown writes about taking the oath of office in her memoirs, this really important moment for her. So she was a woman from upstate New York. She had taught in county schools, and she saw an advertisement for positions in the Indian Service, and she has no idea what this is. And in fact, a lot of white employees had no idea what to expect. And she equates it with, she says, I don't know what Indian Service, what? Is it some sort of missionary? I don't know what this is. But she goes and takes the civil service exam in preparation, and she's the only woman in the room. So she already begins to realize that this is something unusual. She gets the position, and they send her out to Crow Creek. And she says, she tells her father, and he says, oh, Crow Creek, that's the Sioux. They're the ones who killed Custer. And he's a Democrat, and the Republicans are in office, so he's like railing against the Republicans who would send women out there. And she's has this moment where she's like, I thought they were Crow Indians, right? I knew there were Crow Indians, Crow Creek, I don't know. So no idea, right? But so she goes out to the reservation, she reports to the agent, she has to take her oath of office. And she does that, and here's how she describes it. She says, hold up your right hand. A bit startled, I did so. When I lowered it, I had sworn to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, so help me God. In after years, as a notary public at more than one agency, I was to administer that same oath to other young entrants into the Indian Service, never without remembering my secret elation in that Crow Creek office. There, I came of age in awareness, in the realization that I was an entity in my own right, and no longer merely an appendage to someone else's life. So, I mean, that's an oath that very few women were taking, right? Swearing to protect and defend the Constitution is more along the lines of what military men are taking. And even at this time, women coming in, married women coming through the immigration service and being naturalized, your husband's loyalty was what mattered. And married women actually couldn't choose to become citizens. It was whatever their husbands chose. So their husbands would have taken this oath. So very few women are taking an oath like this at this time. And for her, it's incredibly empowering, right? And again, she sort of comes into this awareness of herself, right? But what most white women didn't recognize is that this empowerment, as well as their ability to earn a wage, right, these jobs, however poorly later on, was premised on the oppression of Native people, right? It's premised on this idea that Native cultures need to be destroyed, and that Native children need to be removed from their parents, and that assimilation policy was what's happening, right? They don't see it that way. They see themselves as very benevolent, but they have the power of the federal government behind them, right? And this comes through in certain places, and it's one of the tensions. So, for example, this woman, Cora Bell Fellows, who has a fascinating story that I go into in much greater detail, she starts out as a missionary, and she's sent out to the Dakotas as a missionary, where the federal government then hires her to be a teacher in the Indian Service. And she later marries Sam Campbell, who's a Lakota man whom she meets. He's also in the Indian Service. And so there's an interesting story there, but I can't get into it. She constantly uses, when she writes a memoir, and as she describes her work, she's constantly using this language of missionary work and benevolence. And she always claims that Native people sort of see her example and think it's great and follow it, right? She just has to do these things, and they automatically sort of convert, right? It's a language of conversion. But at the same time, she has these moments in her narrative where she shows it's clearly not about just sort of like, wow, clearly we should do exactly what you do. She's using federal power. So for example, she talks about being a teacher on the Cheyenne River Reservation, and she talks about the leader of one of the villages coming to her and asking her to help him write up a list of English words, right? So how do you spell horse, how do you spell dog, how do you spell sort of this whole list of things, and then he asks for that piece of paper and some other paper and a pen, and he goes home. And she's very excited because she thinks, look, even he is interested, even though he's an adult, and they're kind of a lost cause. But the next morning, none of the children are at her school. And so she goes out to find them. And she finds them with him, and he's teaching them these words off the paper that she's given him. And he says, we don't need you to teach our children anymore. Their fathers, right, will teach them. Thank you, you can go on your way. And she says to him, every morning, I said to him in his own tongue, she spoke the language, when the flag is raised at my school, the great father in Washington commands that every child shall come to school to be taught. If you refuse to let them, in 3 days you will be taken to the guardhouse. And she leaves. And the next morning, all of the children were back in school, right? So she absolutely rejects the idea that the parents can teach the children. And she uses this threat of violence, right, the power of the federal government, to get him to return them. And again, a lot of white women have these moments of empowerment, especially over Native men, in ways that they never would with non-Native men. But again, this empowerment is really something that is on the basis of their positions and on the basis of their race. So, while all women face sex prejudice and all Native employees face race prejudice, only Native women face those two things together, right? This double burden of race and sex prejudice. And there are particular structural constraints and tensions that come out of sort of the structure of the service and the reason that it's set up and this ideology behind it, and then the fact that Native women are being hired. And you see this most clearly in the position of matron, which, as you recall, was really symbolic, right? It was this position that's constantly referred to as a motherly position. But at the same time, Native women, child removal is justified because they're not motherly enough. So what do you do when a Native woman gets into this symbolic position? And it becomes a very sort of tense moment. So matron positions are better paid than, say, cook or laundress, right? So if you come in as a cook or a laundress, you're going to want to move up to a matron position, and a lot of Native women do. But what you see in the records is that over and over again, the superintendents of women who are Native women who are matrons are writing evaluations for them that are sort of poor. And there are words that come up over and over again. So as I went through these records, these files, I kept seeing that Native women as matrons were constantly being accused of being unmotherly, right? And this sort of clustered around a couple things. They weren't keeping the children clean enough, they weren't disciplining the children well enough, or other things, like one woman's described as too flitty, right? Another woman's described as too young and good looking. Right. But the sort of bottom line was they weren't motherly enough, and that's what they say. And the solution is inevitably, all these different superintendents, to transfer or move that woman from the position of matron to the position of cook or laundress, and to hire a white woman in her place. And again, over and over and over they suggest this. So, just as an example, Emma Ledger, who was a Concow woman from the Round Valley Reservation in Northern California, her superintendent wrote, quote, "She serves as well as any Indian woman on this reservation would, but a good white matron with a proper conception of cleanliness would have a great and beneficent influence on the Indian boys," right? So over and over again, that language comes up, and there are these efforts to transfer Native women into these poor paid positions that are manual labor, right, are seen as sort of acceptable for Native women. And so there's these structural constraints that create this tension, that create these efforts to move Native women into these, again, poorer paid positions. But there's another way in which certain tensions arise around Native employees that I think is useful for thinking about how the government is forced to respond in certain ways, right? We often think of Native people as the ones having to respond, but in these cases we see the government being forced to respond as well. as I said, many people use these positions to remain in their communities and to stay with their families. And again, you see a pattern in the language that superintendents use when they talk about employees serving on their own reservations. And that is a language of troublemakers. That word over and over again, they're troublemaker. Or they're forming an Indian clique, which is my favorite one, the sort of cabal of Native employees. But the other thing that they say often is that they speak the language. And again, the inevitable solution is to move them away from their communities. And there's a sense that the reason they're troublemakers is they are sort of being disloyal to the government in favor of being loyal to their own community. And if only the government moved them into a new community, then they would go back to being good federal employees, right? So move these troublemakers away from their communities. And you see the federal government, again, sort of reacting to this. And by 1912, they have changed the application for Indian employment. And they have added a line that says that it's not the policy of the government to employ Indians on their home reservations, right? Now, they actually can't implement this policy fully. They're so dependent on native labor that they have to keep hiring people on their own reservations, but they don't want to, right? And they often try to move people around through the system. And you see this particularly with Native employees who are in, again, sort of these higher positions, better educated Native employees. So in teachers, clerks, matrons, nurses, some of the men in positions like farmer, moving all across the country. And these are just two examples of Julia Decora and Dolly Johnson, two women who you can see had multiple positions throughout Indian country. And in a sample of Native women's experiences that I did, there were 65 Native women, and the average number of positions or different places that they worked, the average number was 6. Right? So again, for people in these better educated in the sense, in these higher paid positions, they are moving them around. They don't want them to be tribal bureaucrats who understand the system and speak their own language. This is dangerous, right? So the federal government has to react. But they create, through this reaction, another unexpected consequence. And that is that as Native people move through the system, they began to really think about themselves through ideas about intertribal sort of identity, right, as Indians. The federal government is constantly talking about them as Indians, right? That shapes their experience as employees. It really matters if you're Native or non-Native, right? Do you take the competitive exam, the non-competitive exam? What kind of evaluations do you get? Do you fill out the Indian form for employment or the regular form for employment, right? So it's constantly discussed, right? Race is constantly there. As Native people move and work in different communities, or as they meet other employees from different tribes, they begin to meet, and the Indian Service is full of single people, and many of those single people get married. There are interracial marriages like Sam Campbell and Cora Bell Fellows. There are white people who marry white people and Native people who marry Native people, but there are also these intertribal marriages. And this is M. Scott Momade's parents, who don't meet in the Indian Service. They meet in Oklahoma, but they join the Indian Service because his family objects to their relationship, and so they want to get away from his family. But the Abners meet in the service. So, so these intertribal ideas about people as Indians who share certain things in common, and one of the main things they share is their relationship to the federal government, right? Now, some Native people are learning this in the boarding schools as they meet children from other nations, but many of them continue to have this experience as employees in the Indian Service or as people interacting with employees who've been sent to their reservation, right? And this, again, creates these unexpected alliances where people who might not have seen themselves as having common cause begin to see that. So, for example, there was a field matron, a Native woman, a Winnebago woman from Nebraska named Ida Rice, who ends up working on the Klamath Reservation in Oregon. And she is a matron, and so ends up in a position where her superintendent is trying to fire her, right? And she's not a tribal member, but the tribe comes to her defense, and they write a petition that asserts, quote, being a member of our own race, Miss Rice is more closely in sympathy with our people and has a better understanding of our needs. And they add, we believe the opposition to Miss Rice is due to her Indian blood. Right? And so, again, Native people begin to see each other as having a lot of things in common, one of which is federal policy, and one of it which is, again, this sort of racial prejudice against Native employees. And they resist that. They fight back with it. And so this happens, again, as with Ada Rice's example, sort of on an individual basis throughout the service. But we see it in a more, what we might call traditionally, I'll get to that in a second. I love this slide. This is Lucy Jobin, who's a Ho-Chunk woman, Ho-Chunk French, who ends up working on the Navajo reservation at the Fort Defiance School. And this image, to me, just really encapsulates that intertribal relationship. So you can see the adobe wall behind her with the Navajo rugs, but then she's wearing her beautiful beadwork from the Great Lakes region, right, in this sort of sense. And Native people, right, begin to teach you. In the book, I think I describe it as sort of early Native American studies classes where they're talking to each other, right? And they're sharing food, they're talking about their traditions, they go to each other's dances, right? And they begin to learn quite a bit about each other. So we see an intertribal identity become sort of specifically political with the formation of the Society of American Indians in 1911. Now this is an intertribal organization, people from multiple different tribes. It's primarily urban Indians, what we would call very well educated, doctors, lawyers, other clerks. And they also, many of them are either current or former employees of the Federal Indian Service, right? And that becomes something around which they have a lot of conversations. And they come together to address a couple things as a race organization. They're contemporaneous with the NAACP, so similar kinds of things happening. One thing is they want to sort of counter the public stereotype that Indians cannot be modern, and the only way they can be modern is to sort of give up all of their culture, right? And so the Society of American Indians can dress up and wear the finest of modern fashion, but they also very much celebrate their Native heritage. So they sort of argue against this, that there's a dichotomy that they have to choose. They say we can really do all of these things. But they also work very hard to, again, bring the public to an awareness of Native critiques of things like federal Indian policy. And they draw very heavily on their previous experience or current experience as employees to talk about this, right? They have firsthand knowledge of what government policy is and why they think it's a problem. And they are good progressives, so they form an organization, they have conferences, they publish a journal, and their conferences are usually in the East and Midwest, sometimes in places like Denver, but they get a lot of newspaper coverage, and again, they have a journal that puts out a lot of articles that they're writing, and they do capture the public's attention, and they do bring this debate into sort of a mainstream conversation, so they're very successful in that sense. They don't last very long. They only last about a decade, and they actually they have a number of internal debates, and one of which that really sort of scars the organization is whether or not people should continue to work for the Indian Service. It's something that they do have some big fights over. But as I said, they are successful in bringing these concerns, and they also are sort of the beginning of a line of activism that continues throughout the 20th century. Sort of the next, the National Congress of American Indians is another organization that comes after them, and so forth. Now this is a group of very famous people whom you've probably heard of. Carlos Montezuma, Charles Eastman, Gertrude Bonin, or Zitkala, she's known. Marie Baldwin, sort of a whole group of people that wrote a lot, and we've heard of them. But it's not just those famous Native activists, right, as I hope I've demonstrated, that Native people in this period and Native employees, which were hundreds if not thousands of people, those employees on the ground every day sought to shape their futures and implement their vision as they struggled with superiors, with coworkers, with federal policy as they were working in their jobs. And indeed, what I took away from my research and what I hope you take away today is that the actions and choices of these people, again, these very mundane choices, what kind of job or how am I going to stay in my community, that these choices that each of these individuals made really mattered. And so what happened when women joined the Indian service were many unexpected things. And in some cases, they were very empowering. Or they at least forced the federal government to react and respond and to contend with them and their choices, and sometimes even change. But sometimes these things were very frustrating and demoralizing, but that the women were not passive. Right? These things didn't just happen to them. They made the best choices that they could under the circumstances and within the constraints of their time, and that they found that they sought to make a future for themselves. So thank you, and I'm happy to address any questions you might have. Thoughts, comments, questions? Dave.
Thank you for the talk, and thank you also for the book that you wrote. And you talked about unexpected consequences and some of the unexpected things that occurred. But I'm wondering, in your research for this project, whether it got into the book or not, what was the most unexpected thing that you learned?
I think what I learned was that, well, there are two things. That there was so much that I didn't actually know about women's history. Just the enormous number of women who were hired and the work they were doing was something I hadn't been taught. But then more specifically, that the experiences of Native people in this moment, in this late 19th, early 20th century, was so much more diverse than I had any idea, right? My knowledge was limited. But that those two things together, sort of women's experiences and then, again, sort of Native people in particular. And then the other thing that I didn't really talk about but sort of gestured to, again, was the number of married couples. I mean, that just kind of blew me away, that middle-class married women were working. They're working with their husbands. I mean, there's really very few other positions that's happening, and missionary work is really one of the only other positions. And so that, again, as a 19th century historian, was something that was really stunning and doesn't fit our general sort of story about the 19th century. So. Oh, sorry.
At this phase in history, did the Indian system have any competition from other sectors? Were the missionary schools competing, and were they potentially sources of jobs, or were they staffed completely by clergy and nuns and such?
So initially, again, the federal government sort of comes out of Reconstruction and is sort of like, well, we can do this education thing. We've done it a little bit, but what they did in Reconstruction was really partnered, particularly with the American Missionary Association, and they would give funds to that association, and it did all of the sort of staffing and hiring. And they initially used that model with Indian policy as well. So in the sort of 1870s and 1880s, it's the contract school system, and the government has a lot of money. Has this? It ends up being about $1 million, I think, at some point in 19th century money, and it sort of doles it out to the Protestant and Catholic missionary groups to do this, to hire their own and to teach. That becomes frowned upon when the Catholics are incredibly successful at capturing federal dollars. And so people, that becomes one of the arguments for civil service reform, is they argue it's about efficiency or, getting rid of patronage, but in a lot of ways it's about getting the Catholics out. And in fact, in 1880, I think it's 81 or 82, right after they passed this legislation, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, Thomas Jefferson Morgan, is a Baptist minister, and his second in command, Dorchester, is a Methodist minister. So they're pretty convinced that we'll keep power. It'll just officially be under civil service. So when the churches are in charge, they're able to hire their own in that sense. So.
Were married women allowed to be teachers in civil service?
They were, and see, again, this is what's so surprising, because by the mid-19th or mid-20th century, when my grandmother was a teacher, she had to keep her marriage quiet, and it wasn't until she got pregnant that she was finally fired, right? I mean, most women were fired upon being married if they were teachers, which I should have added, Dave, to your. So they were allowed to be, and in fact, again, our very deliberately hiring the wives of superintendents. Now, in the rules, in the regulations and rules, it says, we really don't want you to have your children with you. But again, for both Native and white employees, most of them want their kids with them if they're young. And so that becomes another source of tension and another moment where the federal government ends up changing the rules to let the children of employees attend the schools, the white children, who were not, for a long time, not allowed to attend, although some people let them, right, depended on who you were working with. But so this issue of the employees' children becomes a big deal and a big debate that I talk about in one of the chapters. But that's right, yeah, nowhere else are married women, they're all fired if they're teachers and they get married, so.
I'm intrigued by your comment that to a certain extent the Indian Bureau is dependent upon Native labor, and then connecting that with the other point that I was intrigued by, which was that some of the Native women matrons were reprimanded. And the language that you used to describe the reprimands was that they're not sort of appropriately Americanizing the students. And I'm wondering, did you deal at all with an argument or do you see a claim that could be made that the Indian Bureau's dependence upon Native workers in some ways undermined the larger goal that the schools were attempting to achieve, which was to Americanize Native children?
Yes.
Is that an argument you make in the book? Or?
Absolutely, and I absolutely think that's the case. I mean, well, there are a lot of reasons why assimilation isn't successful, right? Native nations don't disappear, right? And that was the goal. And the belief was it would happen in one generation and they'd be gone and the government wouldn't have to deal with it. So that doesn't happen. And part of it is resistance from the children. Part of it is resistance from the employees, right? And something that I look at in the book is, you know, again, these seem like, in some ways, they seem like small resistances, right, on an individual level. But if you look at it across generations, right, the fact that those people manage to stay in their communities and raise their children in those communities, then over the course of the next generation and the next generation sort of is magnified by, you see, you know, Native leaders or even just people who continue to perpetuate those communities and those as political nations. That's really key, right? So this sort of everyday, the power of the everyday is really important. And yeah, I absolutely think that it's one of the reasons that assimilation fails. And it is this tension. It bothers administrators, but they couldn't have done it without Native employees. Right? And I talked about sort of regular employees who were salaried and on an annual rate. These are all regular employees. There's a huge number of temporary employees who are hired, you know, when they need to build a building or do repairs or can some peaches or do extra sewing. I mean, there's just sort of, and they'll hire people in the community for a couple days, right, here and there. And that, I mean, it's like hundreds every year. So they just really couldn't have, Congress would have had to appropriate much more money than it was willing to do. So, yeah.
I'm curious in your research if you came across, I guess, a pattern of abolitionists then becoming Indian rights. I mean, I've come across it just sort of hit and miss, but my research is not really.
I didn't find many teachers, so people who'd worked, say, in the Freedmen's Bureau moving into the Indian Service. Where I do see the overlap are sort of the reformers who become important policymakers. So there are a large number of people who were involved in men who were Freedmen's Bureau officials or who were running things like some of the sanitary fairs or some of the Freedmen's organizations, not African Americans, but whites, running these organizations who then become very heavily involved in the Lake Mohonk conferences, which are some of the big kind of reform organizations that come up with a lot of these ideas. So there is absolutely overlap there, all kinds of people, and I address that a little bit in my first chapter, yeah. So it's really interesting because we think of Freedmen's Bureau as really a good thing, right? Education for citizenship, and they're using the same kind of language of we need to create these kinds of families, and African American men need to be taught to support their wives and children because we don't want the government to have to pay for them. But again, it takes on a different valence with Native nations because it also has the political sense of getting rid of the tribal nation and the land issue.
I was particularly fascinated by some of the pictures of the buildings, the school buildings, right? And some of them are these kind of grand Victorian-style buildings. I mean, it must have been incredibly expensive. And so I'm wondering if you found anything on just the buildings as symbols. And I mean, it seems like they're allocating a huge amount to actual building if they don't have enough to actually pay the people that work in them, right?
That's a really interesting question. I didn't talk as much about the sort of space or the built, the architecture of the buildings. I thought a lot about sort of what the appropriate home space is supposed to look like. And I do talk a little bit about sort of symbols of federal authority. But you're right, and particularly the off-reservation boarding schools, of which I think there were eventually about 25. Those were these sort of flagship institutions. They often were really heavily competed for, communities wanted them because they create jobs, right? In the same way that, now we want whatever, a hospital or something to come in. And so those, they do, they do put a lot into the institution, but then funding isn't always there for, to run the school. And they're constantly asking for more money, both the superintendents as well as the commissioner asking Congress. And people get in trouble for buying food because they've run out of food for the kids, but it wasn't appropriated. So there are all of these issues. But that's but I like that idea of sort of thinking about what the symbolic value of those schools are. Mm-hmm.
Take one more question.
All right, sure. I could go on that. I'm sure you all want to go home.
You alluded to the combination of culture with the different aspects. And I was just curious if you cover in your book any of the art and that aspect with, say, Angel Decora, Martinez, those types of.
I do not so much. So there's a shift around the turn of the century, and particularly into the sort of teens and 20s, where and it's particularly Commissioner Francis Lupp, who begins to, where initially they were saying no native culture, and you can't, native language, it's another issue with the missionary schools, is they use native languages, and the federal government makes that illegal. So no native language, no native culture, completely get rid of this, kill the Indian to save the man. By the turn of the century, Francis Lupp's like, well, but their little songs won't, what damage is that going to do? And that's where you begin to see some of the art come in. And I don't really discuss that. So there's a great book on Angel Decora by Linda Wagner that talks a lot about that. And but it is part of a shift I see, and I actually think that at that moment what he also does is say Native people don't need to be, the school's curriculum was always sort of split between industrial, teaching them how to work, but under this model in the 1880s, 1890s, they're also doing some they're doing other academic work. Francis Lupp really wants to focus on manual training, and he says, look, this isn't going to happen in a generation, and the best that we can do is basically turn out a bunch of workers. And so he's okay with them having some culture as long as they're going to go work on the agricultural farms in Arizona and things like that. So it's part of that bigger shift, which is interesting.
If you're interested in acquiring Professor Cahill's books, we have them for sale, and she is eager to sign them as well.
Sure.
Let's thank Professor Cahill.
Thank you very much.